The secret to sound is tonal imagination, hearing the sounds clearly, vividly in our mind before we play them. Using a severed melody from Lumen Industries, we begin the process. Praise Kier. Hi, and welcome to the Saxophone Academy. Now, today we are studying a beautiful melody as we work on tonal imagination. In this workshop, we're going to play the melody from the Severance Theme, a show my wife and I have recently become obsessed with. It's an enchanting melody, and we're also going to be using it as a vehicle for studying tonal imagination, building our inner ear, our audiation skills, and some exercises that are later in this video that I have for both alto and tenor saxophone. But first, you might ask, what exactly is tonal imagination? Let's start with a quote from Sigurd Rascher from his fantastic book, Top Tones for Saxophone. All musical activity is the outcome of a balance between vivid, colorful, and exact tone imagination and skillful tone production. Without a precise concept of the music to be reproduced, we are unable to render it in a convincing manner. Now notice his very intentional use of the word reproduction. All art is created twice, first in the mind, then in the real world. In order to have a beautiful sound or concept of any piece of art, it must be first clearly imagined in the mind. It can have alterations beyond that in the real world, of course, but having that initial conception is really important, especially with sound. Now, we're dealing with the auditory faculties in this sense, we call this process audiation, hearing the sound before we play it or even without playing it at all. So in today's lesson, we're going to begin this process in the context of the theme from the show Severed. I think I've mentioned I'm obsessed with this show. A beautiful melody by Theodore Shapiro. It's an interesting set of intervals and how they relate to the tonal center, concert E flat minor. So me and the fellas, the Sononauts, we got together and did a chill jazz arrangement of it. Feel free to play along, get the tune in your head, and establish this context for which we'll be doing interval training. So grab your horn or sing along. We're going to be working on that as a solo vehicle next week, and I'll even give you the backing track to practice over next week. It's going to be a lot of fun. In the meantime, we're going to use this as fertile ground in which to build our audiation skills, starting with simple exercises of interval training. So what we're going to do is I'm going to play an interval, and I will notate it in both the tenor and alto, and I want you to listen. And then, in the space provided, I want you to audiate. I want you to hear it very clearly the first time through. The second time, absolutely feel free to play along with it, interspersing audiation, just hearing it and playing it, and make sure they match up. So let's go through these first set of intervals with a few more exercises to follow after this. part 2, let's test your skills. I'm going to play these series of intervals in random order. I'll play them first, then without thinking of a translation step of trying to identify the interval and give it a name, just let your fingers and your ears do the work. Play the interval back of what I just played. You may not get them all right at the first time, or if you're an advanced player, it may be easy peasy. Then focus on the tonal imagination. Can you hear it clearly before you play it? I'll play, you repeat. Now, in part 2 of the exercises, we're going to cover the same intervals, some of them, but in a different context, which changes the way they sound and feel. So in the original intervals, we were always starting on the root. We were in the concert key of E flat minor. So on alto saxophone, we were always starting on C. Tenor, we were always starting from the position of F. Now we're going to move up to the 5th of the key and start doing intervals from there. So again, same thing. I will play the interval starting on the 5th. See if you can audiate, hear them clearly in the space. Imagine if you heard the most beautiful saxophone tone you've ever heard, your own, not mine, though I would be flattered if you chose me. Whatever you hear that clearly in the space. Now again, the intervals presented in random order without notation. Listen closely, reproduce them. Try to minimize your thoughts of translation steps of, oh, that's a minor third, that's a perfect fifth, that's a perfect fourth. Try to just play the interval. Trust your instincts. Repeat this process several times until you can get it 100% correct. These intervals will be the basis of what we start to work on next week with some of our modal jazz training. So for next week, we're going to be taking many of these ideas, this idea of a tonal imagination, hearing something before we play it. That should be going an ongoing thing in your practice. You cannot have a beautiful sound unless you have the expectant mold, that clear conception of what you're pouring your time and your talents into. Listening is one thing, but listening passively and not letting that relate to your audiation, your inner image, of what you want to sound like is a mistake. You need to work on audiation, hearing it clearly in your mind. If you're transcribing a tune, can you hear it in your mind without even singing or playing it? It's an important skill. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's important. Now, next week, we're going to be working on the improvisation when we go into the swing and modal section here, and we'll start building on those exercises and talking about some very interesting concepts to build cool solos over modal jazz. And I'll also give you the backing track to this entire Severance theme. But I will warn you, next week we will have spoilers for the season finale. So if you're not caught up on Severance, or God forbid, if you haven't even been watching Severance, please do so. It's important to me, and I want you there with me. Your innie and your outie will both enjoy that. And both your innie and your outie need to go practice. I'll see you next week. But go practice.